All right, everybody. We have Cameron ready. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. That's the wrong one. All right. Is it not showing? Okay. All right, Cameron. Whenever you're ready.
I'm ready whenever you are.
All right, go for it.
Are we live? Is
Yep, we're live.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Hey, everybody. Hopefully you're tuning in. If not, maybe you're catching this on the VOD or something like that. I'm Cameron Kunzelman. This is a talk. What? You're not muted. Yes, this talk is 10 ways to think about games for the coming decade. I really want to thank the organizers of this for inviting me. I really want to thank everyone who is involved. It seems like there's a lot of people behind the scenes involved in making sure that this is happening and going on. And I want to thank everyone for doing that. As always, for anything that I'm talking about here, anything you want to follow up on, my plan here is to be talking for about 25, 30 minutes, something like that. We have an hour time slot, and then opening up if people have questions about some of the things I'm saying, some of which might be incendiary, I guess, and some of them might not. So yeah, but you can always reach me on Twitter. My DMs are open. You're welcome to tweet at me or whatever. So yeah. Ooh, you might be asking, why am I keynoting this? Who is this person? Why am I here? And why am I somehow some form of an expert on something on the planet? Well, thankfully I'm an expert at least in one thing. So yeah, let me give you a quick rundown of what I'm involved in a broad and general sense. The thing that I do right now and the thing that I've been doing for the last couple years, kind of mainline internet content generation gig, is a thing called Ranged Touch. You can go to rangedtouch.com to learn anything and everything about it. Our kind of pitch behind what we do are critical explorations of media objects. We have a lot of different shows where we do that. We have a thing called Mages and Murder Dads where we're playing through the Baldur's Gate franchise critically, kind of playing them through episode by episode, chunk by chunk. And we've actually made it into the lineage now, or into the kind of children of Baldur's Gate. And we're actually playing Disco Elysium right now. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, we do a similar thing for the Fallout games called Too Much Future. And we do a similar thing for the works of Stephen King in Just King Things, and also in game studies, in Game Study Study Buddies. And the reason I say all of that is that a lot of what I'm talking about in the oncoming 30 minutes or so is going to be from that perspective. I think games are really interesting for a lot of different reasons, but one of the major ones is that they are deep objects, right? They can deliver a lot of different meaning and a lot of different ideas to us, and they do that in a lot of different ways. I'm going to be talking about some of those ways in the oncoming talk here, but Range Touch is where I'm doing that the most right now. Weirdly enough, I did not put on this list, I don't know why, that I was a columnist for Waypoint for a number of years, now Vice Games, and I still write for them quite regularly. So you can see me doing some of that long form work here. I wanted to pay homage, though, to the other places I've been. I wrote for a long time for Paste Games. I was the editor at large there for a number of years. Worked for Kotaku for a year. And I really want to shout out Bullet Points, who has had me write for them a few times. They're a critical organization who they write essays about games. They do 4 essays a month. So if you're interested in other places that are exploring some of the same things that I'm doing in the same terms that I'm exploring them, sometimes you might want to look at my writing in other places. I've also been in another thing, a bunch of other stuff, and I have a PhD. So as I said, I'm at least an expert in one thing that's externally verifiable. But here today, I'm talking about video games. I'm also been a video game developer. I'm kind of in a weird spot where I have spent a lot of time writing about video games on the internet. So I've been writing critically about them, interviews, exploratory features, that kind of thing, what you might imagine that games writing and games journalism is in a broad sense. And in the middle of that, I kind of became a game developer for some weird stuff. I think the two probably largest things that I've done, I kickstarted in the early days of Kickstarter, a game called Apocalypse. You can play it on Steam, resounding failure in all ways other than artistic ones, meaning that I didn't make any money from it. That'd be a lot funnier if there were an audience who could all laugh with me instead of me just sounding sad. But really educational and great experience. Published by Mastertronic, which unfortunately went out of business shortly after. I bet those two things are not related whatsoever. But I did that. Also made a game called Catacresis, which was fairly big in the kind of post-Flash game universe. You can check those things out if you want. More recently, a few years ago, I did a game with Connor Sherlock, who I've worked with several times. He is most well known for his Walking Simulator of the Month Club, if you're interested in checking that out. But Connor and I worked on a game called Marginalia that is also available on Steam. And for whatever reason, that really resonated with people. It's kind of exploratory virtual environment game. So I'm in a weird spot, and hopefully this was part of the logic for inviting me to do this, which is that I've worked as a game journalist, I've worked as a game developer, an indie game developer, in kind of the in the moments leading up to and immediately after what was kind of referred to as the indie apocalypse for video games. I have a degree where I have worked extensively and written about video games extensively, and I have a book coming out soon on video games, an academic volume. So I've got a lot of perspective, hopefully, on the way that games work, and that's what I'm talking about today. I want to ask you if you've heard a little bit about this thing called the LTUX century. A few years ago, Eric Zimmerman, a professor at the NYU Game Center, wrote a piece arguing for a thing called the LTUX century, meaning that the oncoming 100 years, Zimmerman argued, would be one dominated by video games. And this is something you hear all the time. You can hear it from both game developers and kind of games personalities in a broad sense, that games are stronger than ever. They are becoming more and more large parts of our lives. You can certainly look at economic forecasts about this to think about and see people talking about the kind of large numbers that video games do, right? They are competing with blockbusters worldwide and things like that. So that's all to say that there has been an intense focus on what the next 100 years looks like, and what the kind of big maneuvers that happen, in this kind of very speculative and science fictional kind of imaginary. What would life look like when games become the kind of backbone of social life and everything else that has to do with it? I'm not interested really in the next 100 years. If we can make it through 10 years, I'm going to be really happy and going to be really impressed with that. So I'm less interested in the LTUX century and more interested in some ways of thinking about the next 10 years, not the next 100. What I've assembled here are 10 different ways, 10 different perspectives, 10 different kind of sides of the die. That is video games, or that are video games. Unclear on that. I have a PhD, but not in spelling. And certainly not in plurality. So this is, kind of 10 different perspectives that I sat down and thought about, what do I want this talk to do? And I think, well, maybe this isn't always true, but I think generally the best talk is one that gives you a toolbox and allows you to ask better questions. I'm not great at providing answers, but certainly I can provide some hopefully provocative questions, and I've left plenty of time here so that we can maybe chat and get it going. So the first thing here is games as commercial objects. I'm going to move from the most familiar here to perhaps the least familiar, or the most common to the least common, or the most, comfortable. And games as commercial objects are super comfortable for us in a broad sense in our culture, right? We are, since the 1970s, have been very, very at ease with the idea that games in a broad sense are toys. The games in a broad sense are things to be bought and sold and kind of consumed as entertainment. I think that is going to continue, and it's going to continue in a much more robust marketplace, and robust not in the sense of people being able to make their way into it and make money and be able to make livelihoods, but robust in the sense of crowded, packed, difficult to elbow your way into. I actually went over to pull a screen cap when I was putting this together this morning, when I was finally putting together the slides to kind of figure out how I wanted to represent the things I've written down here. And what I think is really interesting here is what Steam, the platform, looked like this morning. I've cropped it a little bit here, but what I was delivered here was a giant banner ad that told me that Capcom, one of the largest and most successful video game publishers in the world, and developers, I guess, was having a big sale, and that I could go and participate in that sale and have a good time. It's up to 80% off, of course, which is rad. And then featured and recommended to me was something that I was already interested in. And so I think that that really does a good job of kind of describing the economic space of video games going forward in the next 10 years. Winners win, and everyone else gets some sort of visibility that is tailored to them through an algorithm that allows lots of things that are really interesting and lots of really cool things to kind of fall through the cracks. I think this is a big part of the kind of games as commercial objects idea, is thinking about games as responsive to market conditions. And those market conditions largely being supported and kind of set by a very small number of actors, a very small number of corporations that kind of get to determine the aesthetic space of what it means to produce a video game and to make a video game and to make a video game that might sell well. Part of this, of course, is not just the people who make the video games, but the platforms on which they are distributed. Steam, the major marketplaces also of Microsoft and Sony. And then occasionally, your Switch sale. If you're lucky, you can maybe get a Mario game for 20% off. But I think that is only going to intensify and get stronger over the next decade. I think we're going to see the same trends that we've seen since the early 90s accelerate, move. I don't see much cracking that's happening there. And even more than that, I see the games as commercial objects often simply being downstream from AAA values, meaning that the AAA and blockbuster games that we're familiar with are going to continue to set the standards for what it means to make video games within the cultural space. And I think that we need to both be aware of that and think of some ways that we could maybe deprogram that or change that or create events or modes that break with that. I think something that's really fascinating about that, or something that we could really be thinking about, I didn't pull it for a slide, but is Ludo Narracon, which I think is coming up. Which is a narrative games based event that's kind of pushed through Steam quite often. So if you're thinking about pragmatic ways of interacting with that, that might be an interesting one. Second way I want to think about games here is as a site of extraction, or as sites of extraction. And by that I mean that it is pulling things out of the world. Video games are parasitic, right? They exist they exist to eat free time, quite literally. If you look at definitions of play, and if you look at definitions of games, which you're often going to find, is that they are predicated on voluntarily giving something up. Right, so we choose to be involved in a game. That's kind of a big part of the magic circle argument as it goes back to the 1930s. There's something interesting that's happening, though, right, and that is continuing to happen in our current time period, where video games are designed in such a way that they want to eat more and more of our time, right? So think about your daily rewards for interacting. This is coming from mobile games from a decade ago at this point. Think about your longitudinal rewards that you're getting for continually putting even the smallest modicum of time into specific video games. Just by giving them a slight amount of attention, you're rewarded for it, right? And creating this kind of Skinner box loop of enjoyment and passive enjoyment for giving them even the smallest amount of kind of sustenance. Also, a big part of that is the microtransaction, right? The movement toward not just free-to-play games, but games that you can confer some sort of benefit in via the extension of money, right? And the extension of even small amounts of money. Something that Daniel Joseph, the game scholar, and an occasional journalist, something he's written about is what he calls battle pass capitalism, which is this idea that games are no longer finished objects. They are no longer things that are kind of one and done and sold to you as a singular object, but rather they are platforms themselves for giving you and distributing to you more content, for more money, for more time, for things like that. And for him, this is just a condition of living in the world today, that many of our systems that we live within are about conferring benefit and conferring marginal, I guess, interactive experience for dedicating your time, dedicating energy, putting clear interaction, I guess, into a system. And so I think that this, again, this is just cribbing directly from Joseph's work, but I only see that as being something that's extended. The other side of this too is thinking of video games as sites of extraction, as ways of mechanisms from parting you with your time and from your money, which are often treated as the same thing. But the other thing here is that that independent game development is often a site of extraction, meaning that independent games that do well or are popular or bring in new aesthetic styles or modes of narrative or ways of engaging with the text. I think a lot about things like Undertale and the way that it was embraced by community, and that broad community was made after that. Blockbuster video games and AAA publishers are very interested in ways of seeing that tested in an independent field with very little risk and then reaping the rewards from it, modulating their content in order to absorb those models, right? And so it's not just extractive in that you're a player and video games are doing something to you and stealing from you, right? Stealing your time and your energy and your money, although that certainly is how they sustain themselves. But it's also that the experiences in the broad culture that we might call video game culture, that those in are themselves a place where something might be extracted and then turned into money by people who didn't have to put very much experimentation down to begin with. By the way, most of these are extremely depressing. The third one here is, this is a good old-fashioned classic, right? Art. I love it. Capital A art. Just getting on Twitter and admiring a Rothko. This is another way that I see video games kind of continuing a trend that they've been on. And as I said, the first few of these I think are pretty familiar. Very famously, Roger Ebert challenged us to imagine that video games could be art and said basically they didn't. I actually chose this picture of Roger Ebert because I think his shirt is very cool and I wish I could own it. And Spielberg during, I think, the late 80s, said that no one's ever cried during level 73 or whatever, which is a very similar kind of opinion to Ebert. I actually think that video games have won the kind of art discussion. I think that we have resoundingly, within the broadest culture of what video games are, I think that many people experience them as art objects and are able to think of them as art objects and able to interact with different types of video games. I know certainly 10 years ago when I was first getting started writing about video games, it felt like I had to spend a lot of time and effort and money, quite literally playing lots of different games to find it. But to make the case that video games should take different shapes and that the form or medium of video games should be able to do a lot of different things. I think a big benefit of, a few years back, lots of major companies made the maneuver to bring in lots of indies. I think Sony during the PS4 was at the forefront of that. And of course, Xbox Game Pass now has made pretty big efforts to bring independent developers in. But I think one of the major kind of follow-ons from that has been that there's a lot more acceptance, at least from where I'm sitting, a lot more acceptance of video games as being lots of different things at one time, and that video games don't have to be just one thing. I think there's still a lot of gatekeeping around that in a broad sense, but even the idea of, World of Warcraft RP servers, which I remember were World of Warcraft, woof, that's hard, launched and listening to people kind of roasting that very idea of it, where that's a huge part of lots and lots of types of video games now. So I think video games as a site where art happens, or as a site of art, or as categorized as art, I think that's going to continue to accelerate. And I also think that that's probably going to be trapped in some kind of way. I think there might, over the next several years, become good video game art that does X, Y, Z, and bad video game art that does A, B, C. And I think we're going to have to be really critical and kind of serious about how we interact with that in order to probably interrupt some of those, normative statements about what video games should be, again, just in a different context. Number 4 here is going to be political arguments. And I mean that in a kind of a broad sense. Lots of people have written about how video games do politics, and lots of games have, or lots of people have written about how they procedurally do that. Ian Bogost's work obviously is such a major part of this, arguing for procedural rhetoric, right? So games have systems, they have mechanisms, they have ways we interact with them, and those things determine the kind of message that we get from them. I think, like, ship has sailed, that's true. I think people accept that in a broad sense. I think what's going to be interesting over the next decade is how that gets leveraged in a lot of different ways. Here I'm thinking about Nikki Case's work in some ways. If you're not familiar with Nikki Case, you can just Google explorable explanations, and I think that'll give you a good sense of their work. These are procedural systems in which you do some basic interaction with a kind of a model, and then the model is gamified and it explains to you how certain things like reputation, for example, work in the real world. I think that using games in these ways and using them in ways that are immediately apparent to people and are broadly accessible is only going to accelerate. Obviously, there are things like news games. Games have been used to make political arguments regularly. That's always happened, but I think that that is going to intensify and get a lot better. I've used the word intensify a lot and accelerate quite a lot here, but that's kind of the pitch of this whole talk. So I think that's one thing that's going to be happening. I think if you are a game development student now, or if you're someone who is in independent game development in a broad sense, and you're interested in thinking about, how can you make something that goes wide and gets people thinking about your work or engaging with your work? I think thinking about how you might make a game that speaks to a contemporary issue and does that seriously and helps explain something that is quite hard to grasp, that's a good use of your time and your talent, I think. I think everyone is generally appreciative of something that is interactive that helps them understand the world that they're in. So I think that that's going to get that more expansive. On the other side of it, I think it's also going to get a lot more cynical. The recent controversy with 6 Days in Fallujah, where there was an interview where they said, look, we're going to be making a game that is about the invasion of Iraq, that is cobbled together from soldiers' experiences. We're going to be making that, but it is in fact not political. And then lots of people, lots of game critics, lots of players, lots of people from the Middle East said that, well, that's maybe not true, right? That maybe that's in fact absolute garbage. And so then the developers kind of flipped, as you can see here. This is the kind of most recent development in that story. But it was hard for me, as someone who has been around for quite a long time and paying attention to the way that the word political gets used by studios like Ubisoft. It was hard to see any of this and not see it as something that was kind of inherently cynical on the part of the publisher. And I have or the developer. And I have no kind of interiority to this. I haven't interviewed anyone from it. But it does seem like any time that Ubisoft says, yes, we make games that have whatever political revolution in them, but but those aren't political, it seems like we get to experience a good week of like criticism and thought about that. And to me, again, having no interiority to it and no kind of interior perspective, it seemed that 6 Days in Fallujah might be a game that would appear and then disappear very easily if it was not maintained in the discussion at some point. And this to me read as a very easy way of making sure that there was discussion and it was engaged with and that people would know what it is. When it's so obviously clear that this is a game that has deep political resonances to it. So I think that games as kind of political arguments is going to operate both ways, or will operate both ways over the next decade. On one hand, it will be a really useful tool for many of us to understand the world we live in. And on the other side, it will be a deeply cynical PR tool in order to drive engagement with games. And I think that if 6 Days in Fallujah is not doing that, which again, I have no way of knowing one way or the other, I think we will begin to see it no matter what. I think that will emerge as a strategy to get games noticed in a sea of games that are coming out constantly. Explorations of self. I think this is we're getting a little bit more weird here. I'm getting a little bit further afield. I think explorations of self are actually pretty interesting right now. I can point you to a game that you should be playing right now. It's called Ritual of the Moon. That's by Kara Stone. You can play it on I think any mobile device, I want to say, or the majority of mobile devices, and it's available on Steam. But it is a game that takes place over the course of a month. You have to play it piece by piece, day by day, and it is a game that is certainly has systems that we might call traditionally gamified, but is also about generating certain feelings or affects or emotions in the player. It is asking you to think about yourself in a broad sense. I think this is a really cool and exploratory place for games to be right now. And I think it also creates really interesting opportunities for both game developers who might want to be asking players to think about it, or might want to be asking players to be considering perspectives outside of their own kind of position and think about them in relationship to other things in the world. And it's also a cool tool for critics because it gives critics the ability to engage with something long term, to really get personal in their kind of criticism or in their review. I think that the type of game that this is actually demands a different engagement than giving a review score and then talking about the graphics. As games get more different than they had been in the past, for lack of a better word, the way that we have to interact with them gets different and changes and asks us to kind of work different parts of our critical mind. I think that's where you get the best criticism, and I also think that's where you get some of the best game design, to be frank. The things that are asking you not to imagine if you are the god of war and throwing an axe at people and thinking about axe physics. I think those are fine, but that's not the thing that gets me thinking the most or considering a game. And certainly it doesn't sit with me very long after I play that. But something like Ritual of the Moon absolutely does, and that doesn't just show up in kind of meditative or personal games like this. I think the recent experiences that people have had with The Longing, which if you haven't checked it out, you should. It's a game that takes place over 400 days, and you have to kind of manage the way that time passes. You're waiting for the king to awaken. It is a very similar kind of feeling, right? It's asking players to interact and think and feel in a certain kind of way, kind of on their own terms, but within pretty designed parameters. I think the same reason this has caught on with so many people recently, even though this game came out a while ago, is that it's touching some of the same feelings and ideas and demands for itself that something like Ritual of the Moon is doing. Community centers. Got to turn my sheet of paper. Games and community have been thought for a long time, right? This is not something that is shocking to anyone. There's plenty of writing at the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the early 2000s talking about digital economies and talking about games as places for people to get together. We have a long history of MUDs and moos and things like that, where games are just as much about the people you meet and the people you hang out with as they are about whatever game mechanics that you're doing, right? Whatever dungeons you're clearing or whatever you're selling to merchants, right? What is interesting and what's going to change, I think, over the next 10 years is that game community itself matters just as much as any part of the game. Community management is a huge thing. If you're paying attention to kind of indie advice as it's distributed now, and I can't really speak one way or the other if I think that advice is good or bad, but the vast majority of it says, look, you need to make sure that people are engaged in your community. So making sure that they wishlist your game and join your Discord community, or making sure that they understand that those community functions like Discord messages or whatever, or even newsletters, which are kind of coming back, that those are places where they will get exclusive information, or they'll know things before other people, or they'll be able to see developments in the game before the vast majority of people. This is the community management folks coming to get me, by the way. They hate it. They hate when I'm breaking out their info. But there was a siren that went by in case you can't hear that in the microphone. But yeah, the value center of the game, right, is no longer just the systems itself, but it's the ability to create robust communities around them that can then also be marketed games and then can also be sold games. If you engage with publishers in any kind of way or PR companies in any kind of way, something that's changed over the past couple years is that you now have to be pretty explicit about what kind of audience you have, not just what publication do you write for, which was what it used to be when I began writing, but now you have to say how many Twitter followers you have. You have to talk about how many YouTube subs you have. How many people are part of a Discord is now a number that some PR companies ask for when you request keys and codes. And so that thing itself, the ability to accrue community, is going to matter just as much, and for communities to transition from game to game together, which has always been sporadic and always been strange. I think that's going to get a lot more controllable. And I also think that there's going to be invested action in trying to figure out how you sell to specific communities. I think that will become its own kind of PR job. It kind of is already, influencer relations and things like that. I think it'll get more explicit. Games as conversations. Games, the movement of games as they exist right now is that they, for the most part, the vast majority of games appear and kind of disappear in 6 weeks or so, right? So your major AAA releases come out. If you don't follow the community, you have not heard very much about the most recent Call of Duty game, not Warzone, but the other one. You haven't heard very much about it recently, unless you follow it and you're a big player of it, because it has generally fallen out of the broad conversation about games. The same thing has happened to Valhalla. I don't see very many op-eds writing about the newest Assassin's Creed game right now. Games have a wax and wane relationship with the conversations that they start. I think that something that's going to be leaned into over the next 10 years and ways we need to be thinking about games is that they are sites for certain conversations to happen, and they afford certain conversations. And there's going to be, I think, an increased focus on developing games that can sustain longer conversations. And I think there are kind of two different places where I've seen that recently. The first one is Hades, which is remarkable in that it has been out for a while, and I'm continually seeing criticism being produced about it, whether that's video criticism or whether that's written work for major places or whether that's blog posts or whatever. It has had a life that is kind of shocking, actually, in the past 5 or 6 years. I can't think of another game that has produced such an effusive amount of writing for such a long time. Right. It's not that every website produced one piece and forgot about it. It clearly has a long tail where people are interested in it, and they're interested in talking about, for example, the role of family. You can check out Grace's piece at Uppercut Crit recently for a really interesting criticism of the way that family dynamics work out there. And for other games, that kind of really long tail argument wouldn't exist. And so I think that something that's going on with Hades, especially its kind of run based narrative stuff, is that it is able to move at a pace that is both really quick, if you're someone who's very good at the game, and very slow if you are not as focused on the game or you're giving it more time or whatever. And so I think there's this kind of stretchiness to it that I'm not quite sure was intended by the developers, although maybe it was. But that stretchiness has allowed for a slower paced and longer form conversation to happen about it. That I think is really interesting. I think that game developers crack the code on that are going to be leaning into. If you're an independent game developer or you're someone who is thinking about doing game development for a career, especially narrative design, I think you should be thinking about that because conversation and discussion about something is a way to ensure that the game has life kind of beyond itself and beyond its release window. The other kind of example I think of this is The Last of Us Part 2, although it certainly didn't have as long of a tail. But it was a game that was so grimly disgusting in many ways that everyone felt like they had to speak to it in some way. I think that, where Hades does that in a complicated and interesting way and has lots of different ways, I think that The Last of Us Part 2 has a very cynical way of generating conversation and a very cynical way of getting people to interact with it and think about it. And I was one of those people who did it, and I ended up writing a whole book chapter about it. I see myself as a part of it. This is in no way a criticism of anything other than The Last of Us, but I do think that the kind of cruelty of that game was in some ways mimicking the form of the prestige drama, where violence and destruction and the kind of quote unquote grim and grittiness of dystopian kind of absolute violence that happens was thought of as a way to get people to engage with it. I can't believe they went there. The kind of maneuver that has been a part of exploitation cinema for a very long time. And so these are obviously two different strategies of doing it. And I think if we're thinking about successful strategies, Hades is much more successful in the sense that I think it will carry conversation for a longer time, whereas I don't really hear very many people talking about The Last of Us Part 2 right now. The other thing I want to say here is ambivalence machines. Video games have traditionally been very good at prepackaged emotions. We step into the body of Link and we experience what it means and feels like to be the center of the world, right? We're a hero, we're going out there. We might have to overcome some adversity, but the kind of anchor of the game is that we will overcome that adversity. It's the same mechanism of Dark Souls and how everyone ends up who plays Dark Souls or any of the Soulsborne games kind of comes to the conclusion that, they're about this kind of struggle of individuals overcoming the conditions of the world and all of these kinds of things. I think something that we're going to see in the next decade of video game development is a lot more openness to ambivalent emotions. And not having clearly packaged ideas or feelings or framings from other genres. I think that we've had some of that. I think the game Florence does a pretty good job of weaving in and out from some of these things. And I think that quite a lot of independent developers, especially things that you might find on itch.io, that those things might do it, but not all of them. When I was thinking about this talk and the best way of expressing this, I was thinking about the end of Beau Travail, Claire Denis film from 1999, kind of a classic of French art cinema. I'm sure that gets everyone hyper excited that I'm talking about it. But the end of it is this kind of wondrously puzzling thing where someone's life is completely ruined because of something that he did. And it cuts to the end credits, which are just him dancing in this like disco in front of this mirror, and he's kind of like spinning out and kind of kicking his feet wildly and collapsing, and he eventually leaves the screen, and that's the end of the film. And it kind of famously for the past 20 years, there's been a lot of like, what is going on here? And how are you do you feel about it? And when you watched it, or at least when I watched it for the first time, I had this deep feeling of unsettledness. And kind of elatedness, like, wow, like this is what cinema can do. I don't often feel that with video games. I often feel that in the most emotional moments of video games, that they're just appealing to the melodrama of the 1940s of kind of classic Hollywood cinema. I'm interested in more ambivalence in video games, of things that give you tools or aesthetics where you feel something, but is not telling you how to feel. And it certainly is not in conversation with the kind of HBO drama aesthetics I was talking about with The Last of Us, or even the kind of, I don't know, justified style, singular heroism that you might see in, I don't know, from God of War to The Last of Us Part 2. So that's the other thing. It's another thing to kind of think about outside of the normal or the regular maneuvers of games. Another one here is that there are articulations of movements. Over the past few years as a games writer, I got to see a lot of interesting small movements of games appear and then kind of make statements about themselves and then kind of maneuver or morph or disappear or change. There was the queer games movement, the alt games movement, cozy games, and there's a lot of kind of maneuvers now. We're kind of in a time of monsters. The future is waiting to be born in some ways. So I'm kind of waiting to see what the next big wave of concerted and interested independent game developers are. But when you're paying attention to game movements in a broad sense, and you're paying attention to weird small games that are coming out, you get to see the kind of broad-based focus that happens for I don't know, a class of developers or a type of developer, or I don't know. It's kind of a vibe, for lack of a better word, right? And so the game, in capturing the vibe, and then you play 5 or 6 games that are all in that similar vibe, what you end up running into is this kind of recognition that they're all speaking to a moment that could be spoken of, or that could be kind of encapsulated as a movement that's maneuvering. And if you're looking for that, or trying to think of something that is up and coming, if you're looking for an example of that, I think the games of Celestia are kind of big for me there. Especially A Hand with Many Fingers. If you haven't played this game, you should play A Hand with Many Fingers. It's one of my favorite games from the past year or so. It is a conspiracy game where you unravel a real world conspiracy that happened, and it's about archival work. It's about digging into the archive and kind of making a board of connecting the dots. Obviously, Kolestia's work has a very political edge to it. They are explicitly leftist games that are advocating for communist or socialistic politics to them, and they're deeply critical of the world that we live in. But there's something going on here with the way that Kolestia designs these systems that do this, but also a whole set of aesthetics that aren't necessarily deep every time. But they all very clearly communicate what they're doing. It's an interesting combination of all the different ways that games can kind of work on these things that I've been talking about so far. And so I would say that, if you're making games now and if you're thinking about games going forward, you should really be paying attention to how games group together. If you're making games, how do your games speak to the cohort of peers that you have? And if you can't find your cohort of peers, I would suggest scrolling through itch.io and then looking for people who are making things like you and then reaching out to them and saying, hey, we work on similar things. What do you think about this, and getting feedback. I think the strongest thing for games, period, and especially games going forward, is the development of community. And I think articulations of movement, thinking of games as that, is pretty helpful. The next one is a little bit of a bummer in a broad sense, but we are about to be entering into an era. I mean, we're already in an era of extreme climate change. And that's only going to accelerate over the next 50 years, right? 2030, the mid 2030s are kind of being pointed to as a crucial tipping point of no return. Some estimates say that we're already in the moment of no return. And I think what's going to be fascinating and nightmarish is that when games start to be used to memorialize or to work through people's feelings of the global collapse of climate that we're all going to be living through. And so when we're thinking about predictions for the next 10 years, right, I don't think that we can think about, or I don't think we can just assume that our way of living and our way of working with games and our way of making games is going to remain unchanged forever. The contradiction that is the environment itself is going to have some sort of impact on that. And so I'm interested in thinking about games as modes of mourning and paying attention to when those appear. I think a kind of early precursor that certainly doesn't imagine itself this way, but I think works out this way, is Lycaonia, made by Paolo Pedercini, which is a game about a far future utopia, dystopia, that actually creates conditions or allows you to interact with the kind of conditions of global dystopian collapse. You should check out this game if you haven't already. My final thing here, which is unnumbered, is that banal invisibilities, meaning that games are going to be everywhere and nowhere. Right? There's a lot of reportage recently about Amazon's use of intensified gamification in their warehouses in order to get people to work harder and work more. There are, if you have insurance, congratulations if you do, but if you have insurance, you know that insurance companies are quite interested in gamifying your health. They're interested in gamifying the way that you interact with them. They reward you with points and abilities. There are 1,000 point systems for everything you can imagine right now, from credit cards to banks to hotel room systems. Everything has a kind of shadow game happening behind it where you get rewarded for playing optimally, or at least playing the game, period. I think the other side, I began with the ludic century argument from Eric Zimmerman, and I think the other side of that is that games, and Zimmerman argued this, games become invisible and they go everywhere, and people who understand how to play them will get rewarded in serious and in real ways. And the people who can't interact with them or don't understand them as games, or don't have the kind of leg up of playing from a young age, a broad sense for these games, will get punished for it. And I think that going forward in the next decade, thinking about the ways that games kind of eat the world, and the ways that games are parasitic to so many of our cultural and economic and social functions, is going to be critical for living a livable life. And so that's my depressing end, I think, to this. So that's 10 different ways of thinking about games in a broad sense for the next 10 years. Hopefully that's helpful. You can always reach out to me on Twitter at @Kunzelman. I don't know. I talked way longer than I thought I would. So I don't know if we have time for Q&A or not, but someone can let me know. No one is letting me know. We're hanging. Hey there.
I think we had a few questions in chat.
Sure.
If anybody wants to post any questions right now, we'll get them answered for you here. Let me switch that back.
I didn't mean to wear the same shirt that I had on my headshot. This is what I look like, by the way.
Okay. So I just want to do that then.
Also, if there are no questions, that's okay too.
Okay, so first question is from Haley Lee. Do you think other industries should implement gamification?
Um, that's a great question. So, I guess the kind of question there is that do you think that gamification is value neutral or not? Meaning that do you believe that gamification doesn't come with political claims or parts to it? I would say that gamification, if what gamification means is that you're looking for ways to get other people to be incentivized to do the thing you want them to do, then no, I think gamification is probably bad in that case because it's just another mechanism of convincing people to do something that they might be ambivalent about, right? So, I don't know if it's good that my credit card, for example, has a system that incentivizes me to spend money in some places rather than other places. That encourages me to go to PF Chang's all the time because that has a very marked and explicit effect on my local economy. It means I'm not going to go to a mom and pop store, right? I'm not going to go to a local restaurant. So like even that form of light gamification comes with political assumptions that chains and the partnership chains that they're able to pay money to reward me for doing that, that those are inherently going to be better, right? Or they're better if I'm playing the game optimally in that regard. And certainly in the Amazon case, I think that is just objectively bad, right? In the sense that the Amazon warehouses seem to be places where I would not want to work. Encouraging people to push their bodies to limits that are beyond fair or beyond good working conditions by chasing badges, I think that's bad. Now, do I think that means that implementing game-like systems into all forms of life is inherently bad? No, I don't. But I do notice that for the most part, when we talk about gamification interacting in other industries in particular, it tends to always look really dystopian to me. I'm not going to say 100% of the time, but I think that from the perspective of, if anyone in middle management ever asks me, should I implement gamification, I'm going to be highly suspicious about what the reason for gamification is. Is it going to be making someone's life better? Probably not. That is a wonderful dodge of a response, I think, probably. But I think that we need to be much more critical about the end goals of what gamification will do when it's implemented in specific scenarios. I think we've had lots of years of games for change style rhetoric that's just inherently better to give people these ways of engaging with things. I'm not the first person to be critical of that. There's a lot of people. Paolo Pedercini, who I talked about before, gave a keynote at Games for Change where he did this exact same maneuver that I'm doing. I'm not originating this argument at all, but I'm highly suspicious of the way that gamification is often implemented. But thank you for the question.
All right. Next, we have Nice Boy 95. Do you think games will actually dominate this century, and will they make us consider these points you brought up?
Well, sure, probably they'll dominate the century, meaning that if global capitalism continues trundling on in the way it does and finds points of expansion for itself, it probably. I imagine they will be the dominant entertainment form, at least monetarily. They're pretty close now. I don't think that they're all going to implement. I don't think everything that I talked about today is going to be kind of like agnostically implemented by like games in a broad sense. I think what I hope that I've offered today are 10 kind of things to be looking for, meaning 10 things that kind of exist in nascent forms right now, but which will get stronger. And like any system, right? I mean, this is an ecology. It's a complex system. In any complex system, certain things emerge and they don't work, right? And they disappear. And in any complex system, certain things emerge alongside other things, right? R.C. Lewontin, who is a kind of a famous biologist in the latter half of the 20th century, wrote about this, that for him, kind of ecological niches don't exist because the condition that allows an evolutionary moment to happen, it co-evolves at the same time. As the creature does, right? So the way that I'm able, I'm a little woodland creature, right? Imagine me as a little woodland creature. I emerge in with a certain kind of a fur
I see.
color that blends in with the grass at the same time as the grass is emerging in evolution, right? We coexist and we emerge together. So I don't think everything that I talked about is going to accelerate and emerge in the same way that I think it will. I think they all have little seeds in the present, right? And the future is going to grow out of those things. And so I think some of them will appear and some of them won't. But I would encourage you to be looking for them, right? And if you're a developer who thinks that you can, or a student or a critic who thinks you can lean into some of those things and really speak to them, hopefully I've offered you that, something to be looking for. But if it doesn't happen, oh, okay. Well, plenty of people call shots and they don't go anywhere. It's kind of a gamble.
All right. Next question is, with Steam and itch offering different platforms for distribution, how do they play into the next decade of games?
My hope is that itch becomes the worldwide dominant game distribution platform, and I don't think it's going to happen necessarily, right? But when I think about the way that Steam shovels things in front of our eyes, and I think about the way that Itch does the same thing in their strategies for doing those things, right? Itch is very much about creating situations and mechanisms where things can emerge, right? So I think it's a really cool, again, I'm using ecology metaphors here, but it's a really cool kind of interconnected system that allows you to curate bundles or curate playlists or things like that and put them together and then just allow people to interact with those things. You can find lots of really interesting. I was looking recently, for example, Michael Lutz and I were looking for two-player tabletop games. And that kind of granularity, if it doesn't exist as a tag on Steam or any other marketplace, you're just never going to find it. You're going to have to do a lot of self-selective work to figure it out. I write quite often about city builder games, which has its own tag on Steam, and I still miss maybe a third of the ones that appear just because they're not categorized appropriately or players don't tag them correctly or whatever. I think that somewhere like Itch is thinking about what will people do with this? What will people do with our platform that enriches their kind of gamey life? That enriches their life interacting with games culture. I think platforms like Steam have no interest in that, and I would include Epic and GOG in this as well. My cynical belief is that, yeah, Steam will continue to accrue wealth and will continue to be bigger and will continue to be the dominant form. And it will constrain us in ways that are a bummer and probably bad culturally for us. It will constrain the ways that we interact with the world. That's a bummer. I think, my kind of pitch at the end here is you should go to itch.io and make an account and buy a couple things and, contribute to that culture.
Absolutely. Um, I personally had a question related to that. What is your thoughts on all these companies making their own platforms like Origin and the other
Epic Game Store.
Epic Game Store and all those?
Well, I think Steam having competition, right? And I'm not the big market solves problems kind of person, but I do think Steam having competition is good. I think we're also on the other side of that. Origin appeared and now is functionally gone, right? They caved and put all their games back on Steam recently. So I don't think that'll happen with Epic. I think that Epic will continue to have its existence as this kind of. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Epic is not competing with Steam in a way that we think it is. Epic is doing the Sony and Microsoft move. If you look at what that storefront looks like and the way it operates and the way it surfaces very particular things at certain times, it is mimicking the way that the PlayStation Store works. It is mimicking the way that the Microsoft Store works, the Xbox Store works. It's not trying to mimic or replicate the kind of open platform and open market that is Steam. And so what's interesting there, I guess, is that Steam, and these are predictions that were made when Epic kind of appeared and had a much more curated space. That Steam is just kind of the infinite dumping ground for whatever goes onto it, and then the kind of magic of the market of most best-selling with the best reviews, those rise to the top, and then everything else is infinitely difficult to find. A big part of my life as a games critic and a writer is digging through Steam in particular, just looking for things that I might find are interesting. And I spend a lot of time doing that, and I still, when I ask for recommendations, whatever, I still end up with 5 or 10 things regularly, every couple months that I think are really cool and really interesting projects that I just algorithmically, even manually sorting for time and release and things like that, just can't find. So that's all to say, right? I think that I would see Steam, or my prediction, right, if I'm allowed to predict, is that Steam continues to do that with no checks or balances on it because ultimately everyone else is interested in a highly curated store that generates the most possible profit. And Steam, for all of its issues, is still a grab bag where you can put whatever you want. It's just not interested in showing it to anyone. This again is why I would encourage you to go to itch.io. They have a pretty good curatorial team. They're showing you stuff pretty regularly. And if you find creators that you like and playlists that you like, that people have put together, you're going to get a pretty regular stream of interesting stuff coming towards you.
All right. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, we will wrap this up. All right.
Marx is
I want-
writing something.
What?
Marx is writing something.
Maybe one more.
Uh-oh.
NS Chaff 1234 asked, "Do you think games trying to have a longer tail of discussion about them will have any impact on game preservation?"
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. I think that is a truly speculative, question about how things work. I mean, I would say currently that's not the case, right? I mean, there are games that we talk about very regularly that are still pretty hard to get a hold of. Metal Gear Solid, which, one of the most, I don't know, important games certainly to ever exist, and certainly one that gets talked about really regularly. Twin Snakes, pretty hard to get a hold of as far as I know. The kind of remake that was made for the GameCube, and you need to have a PS3 and a physical disc, or you need to use the PS3 store. And I think that's it. I think that's the only way to play Metal Gear Solid right now, right? So I guess the answer is that games that we talk the most about that are historical still don't really get good preservation right now, but I don't know what that means going forward. I would hope it would mean that people would do it, but you can even look at the kind of uproar around the Silent Hill remasters that happened maybe like 6, 7 years ago. When those happened and they just butchered those games when they ported them to the Xbox 360, those were remastered because they have a long tail of conversation and discussion in players. They made them unplayable in that regard, and they're still kind of difficult to engage with. So that hasn't worked out so far. Conversation equating to good preservation. But I guess that's also part of the question too, is all preservation good preservation? I think that more discussion probably equals some kind of preservation. The reality probably is, though, that community solutions to this are going to be more efficient and sufficient and better for the world than the corporate decisions that are actually behind it. Interpret that how you will.
All right, next question. Do you think the price of a 90-minute game will ever reach or surpass the price of a 90-minute movie?
That's about right there now, right? I mean, not all of them, but, well, I don't know how long, like, Adios is, for example. Kind of a recent big narrative game. I haven't played it yet. I think that's at the $15, $20 mark. I think it should. I mean, I'm a big proponent of video games should be paid for. I mean, if you can't pay for them, that's kind of a different discussion, right? But I don't think inherently time to complete a video game should determine price to purchase video game, right? I'm very comfortable paying $15. I don't know, prices vary in the world, right? But I'm pretty comfortable at this point paying $15 for 90 minutes. In fact, I would be honest with you, I'm much more interested in paying $15 for 90 minutes a few times than paying $60 for 100 hours. And I say this as someone who was working on a book about the Assassin's Creed franchise and have put, at this point, thousands of hours into those games, right? I am in for these long games, and I actually think that a lot of those things are really interesting. But sight unseen, purely only being on the receiving end of PR, a 15 or a 90-minute or 2-hour game that a lot of people are really interested in, saying are interested and are talking about as interesting for $15 versus I picked on God of War enough this time, for this, so I can do it one more time. Versus paying even $45 for God of War, I'm interested in paying the 15 for the 90-minute game every single time. And I think that, I think as long as game publishers and game platforms are invested in telling you how long a game is, think back to the PlayStation 1 in the back of the box, and that every Final Fantasy game is an 80-hour experience. That's part of the promo. As long as we are in that mindset, which I think we still are now, I don't think that's going to change very much. I think, fortunately, games like The Last of Us 2 do move the kind of bar by saying this is a piece of like interesting art first. I think The Last of Us did a really interesting job of pushing itself as like a serious game that has like cinematic weight behind it, and you should think of it in that way. I think that that's a good pathway to opening us up to a different economic relationship with games. On the other side, though, exactly what I talk about the other, games are seen of as sites of extraction. There are places where your money and your time can be pulled out of you over a very long period of time. Ubisoft is interested in selling you small DLC packages for, Assassin's Creed Valhalla. They want you to look at the cool horse skin and think, dang, I'll pay $2 for that when it's on sale. They're not interested in ever producing something that's 90 minutes long for $10 even, or $5 even. You can look at their kind of independent games, their smaller games that come out of Ubisoft, and it's just nothing. It doesn't compare to the kind of thing that your question is asking about. So I think that if this happens, it will be because there are two economic conditions emerge, right? A very strong kind of arts and culture sector that understands that games can operate in that way, 90 minutes for $15. And then the, mass market media kind of Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed experience. On the other side, I see a more likely scenario where those economic bases fragment and split, which has happened already to some extent, than I do some massive shift where everyone gets on the same page together. Thank you for a question. That's really interesting. It's an interesting thing to think about.
All right, next question. Will it be possible or desirable to escape the ludic in the ludic century? That is, do you think that there are still modes of life that are not dominated or characterized by gamification and other ludic processes, particularly for people in hyper-developed economies? And is it worthwhile to work to try and develop and live in such modes?
Yeah, no. I don't think I do not think it is possible to escape the kind of ludic. I think that it's already there, right? I mean, the backbone. If you live in the United States in particular, right? The backbone of our economy is like very explicit and weird bets about the possible economic futures that exist for us, right? And they're happening at light speed, quite literally. They're happening in fiber optic line, and so. So no, sorry, I don't think it is, right? And I don't think that we can kind of, I'm John Zerzan. I'm techno-primitivist our way out of this, right? I don't think we can move into the mountains and just pretend that we're not involved with it anymore. I think the better maneuver here is to not pretend that video games are their own kind of demarcated space, but to recognize that ludic production or gamic production is happening everywhere, and developing both literacy for that, right? Making sure that we understand that. I think that the criticism of video games should be taught in schools. I think they should be taught in high school at the minimum. I think film studies should be too, but I think we've lost the path on that. But I think these things are deeply important on an educational level precisely because of the kind of weight that they have on us. I also think that like better ideas or more explicit ideas about economics should be taught in those places too. But so that would be what I would say. One, no, it's not escapable. Two, the best strategy that we have in a pretty thin toolbox of strategies is education and ways of thinking about it, and ways of understanding how the ludic kind of constrains us in lots of ways, and the way it's tied into our economy. I'm a big fan of James S. Hans's The Play of the World, kind of a weird philosophy book from the 80s on the philosophy of play. Good luck getting your hands on it. Way out of print. You can listen to our episode of Game Studies Study Buddies if you're interested in learning more about that. You can just Google Game Studies Study Buddies, or you can go to pureideology.biz to listen to it. It's like maybe a year ago in our episodes, but I'm highly influenced by this kind of argument that the transformations that happened in the 1970s and 80s in capitalism had as much to do with the production of play as anything else. And we're living in the hangover of that in some ways. So I only think it's going to get more intensified. You can't vote with your wallet, or just vote, or walk off into the woods to get rid of it. And so I think we got to face that challenge head on.
All right. We don't want to take up too much more of your time. Did you want to talk about what you're working on now at all?
No, just the stuff I talked about already. Working on a book on Assassin's Creed that should be out maybe next year. I have a book coming out called The World is Born from Zero, which will be coming out also, I believe, at the beginning of 2022 at this point. You can follow me on Twitter at @ckunzelman. That's visible there. And check out all the stuff that I'm into and everything that I'm doing. Go to rangedtouch.com if you want to hear me talk more. I don't know why you would, but if you did, you could do that. And that's what I'm up to. Check me out. I should have more writing coming out soon. I had to take a little bit of a break to finish my book, but yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for coming to the talk, and I hope it was useful for you.
Thank you for coming. We really enjoyed your talk.
Absolutely, anytime. Do I just hang up now? What do I do?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, goodbye, everybody.
All right.
Goodbye.